In the small town of Willow Creek, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, life seemed to move at a slow and predictable pace. The townsfolk were a close-knit community, sharing in each other's joys and sorrows. Hello, welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. Among them was a man named Michael Thompson, a father of two, known for his unyielding work ethic and deep faith. Michael's life had always been a delicate balance of hard work and devotion. He worked as a carpenter, crafting furniture and repairing homes with skill and care. His wife, Emily, was a nurse at the local clinic, and together they managed to provide a modest but loving home for their children, Anna and Jacob. Life, while not easy, was good. The Thompson family was content with what they had and believed that their faith in God would carry them through any storm. However, the storm that was about to hit their lives was unlike anything they had ever faced. It began subtly, with whispers of an economic downturn that soon became a harsh reality. The local factory, which employed most of the town's population, announced its closure due to financial difficulties. The news sent shockwaves through Willow Creek, and Michael's carpentry business began to suffer as customers tightened their belts, choosing to repair old furniture instead of buying new. Emily, too, was affected. The clinic where she worked had to make cuts, and with fewer patients able to afford health care, her hours were reduced. The Thompsons found themselves struggling to make ends meet. Bills piled up, and the stress of financial insecurity weighed heavily on their once happy home. Despite the mounting pressure, Michael and Emily remained steadfast in their faith. Each night, they gathered with their children to pray for strength and guidance. Michael, in particular, held on to his belief that God had a plan for them, even if it wasn't clear yet. But as weeks turned into months, and their savings dwindled, doubt began to creep into their hearts. One evening, as Michael sat at the kitchen table, his hands rough and calloused from years of labor, he received a letter that made his heart sink. It was from the bank, informing them that they were 3 months behind on their mortgage. The letter was a final notice: pay the overdue amount or face foreclosure. Emily, who had been trying to stay positive, broke down when she saw the letter. "What are we going to do, Michael?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. "We've always done everything right. We worked hard, saved what we could, and trusted in God. Why is this happening to us?" Michael had no answer. The weight of the situation crushed him, but he couldn't let his family see his despair. He took Emily's hand and looked into her tear-filled eyes. "We will get through this," he said, though he wasn't sure how. "We have to believe that this is part of God's plan for us. Maybe it's a test of our faith." But as the days passed, it became harder for Michael to hold onto that belief. He took on any job he could find, no matter how small or underpaid. He worked long hours, sometimes coming home after the children had already gone to bed, his body aching and his spirit weary. Emily, too, picked up extra shifts at the clinic whenever possible, but it still wasn't enough. The final blow came when their old, reliable car broke down on the way to the grocery store. Without the means to repair it, they were left stranded. The car had been their lifeline, allowing Michael to take jobs in neighboring towns and Emily to reach the clinic. Now, even that was taken from them. As Michael stared at the broken vehicle, frustration boiled over. He slammed his fists onto the hood, a cry of anguish escaping his lips. "Why, God? Why have you forsaken us?" The outburst startled him, for it was the first time he had ever questioned his faith so openly. Emily, who had been praying for a miracle, heard Michael's cry and rushed outside. Seeing her husband, the man she had always admired for his strength and faith, on the verge of breaking down, she felt a deep sorrow. But instead of despairing, she walked over to him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Michael," she said softly, "we can't give up now. We've come this far together, and we have to believe that there's a reason for all of this. Maybe we just can't see it yet." Michael turned to her, his eyes filled with pain and doubt. "I don't know how much more I can take, Emily. I feel like we're losing everything, and I don't understand why. What if we're not strong enough?" Emily held his gaze, her own eyes shining with tears, but also with resolve. "We are strong enough, Michael. We have to be. For Anna, for Jacob, and for each other. We can't let this defeat us. Her words, though simple, reignited a small spark of hope within Michael. He pulled her into an embrace, finding comfort in the warmth of her presence. "You're right," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "We can't give up. We have to keep fighting, no matter what." That night, as they lay in bed, Michael found himself praying more earnestly than he had in months. "Lord, I don't know what your plan is, but I ask for the strength to endure whatever comes our way. Help me to be the husband and father my family needs, and guide us through this darkness." Unbeknownst to them, this prayer marked the beginning of a journey that would test their faith and resilience in ways they could never have imagined. Willow Creek, once a town of comfort and predictability, was about to become the backdrop for a story of survival, hope, and the power of faith in the face of overwhelming odds. The days in Willow Creek grew shorter as autumn set in, bringing with it a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the town. For the Thompsons, each day felt like a struggle against a relentless tide of misfortune. Yet, despite the heavy burden of their circumstances, they held onto the small threads of hope that still remained. Michael continued to take on every odd job he could find, no matter how meager the pay. He mended fences, fixed leaking roofs, and even helped clear out old barns for neighbors who could barely afford to pay him. But the work was not steady, and each night he returned home more exhausted than the last, his hands raw and blistered. Emily's situation was no better. The clinic, once a bustling center of the community, now felt like a ghost town. Patients were fewer and farther between, and the staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew. Emily worked long hours for little pay, but she never complained. She knew they needed every penny to keep the house from being taken away. The children, Anna and Jacob, were too young to fully understand the gravity of their situation, but they sensed the tension in their parents. Anna, just 10 years old, often asked why her father seemed so tired and why her mother was always worried. Jacob, who was only 6, had started having nightmares about losing their home. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Michael returned home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. The sight of her, so worn down and defeated, pierced his heart. He sat down beside her, gently placing a hand on her back. "Emily," he said softly, "we'll find a way through this. We always do." She lifted her head, her eyes red from crying. "I just don't know how much more we can take, Michael. The mortgage is due next week, and we're still so far behind. I don't see a way out." Michael hesitated, then spoke the words that had been gnawing at the back of his mind. Maybe it's time to think about leaving Willow Creek." Emily stared at him, shocked. "Leave? But this is our home, Michael. Where would we go?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But staying here with no work, no prospects, it's killing us. Maybe there's another town, another place where we could start over. We could sell the house, pay off what we owe, and move somewhere new." The thought of leaving the only home they had ever known was painful, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it might be their only chance to survive. He looked at Emily, searching her face for any sign of agreement, but all he saw was fear and uncertainty. "I don't want to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want to uproot the kids, take them away from everything they've ever known. We can't just run away, Michael. We have to trust that things will get better." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but I can't keep watching us sink deeper and deeper into this pit. Something has to change, Emily. We can't keep going like this." Before Emily could respond, they heard a knock at the door. Michael frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for visitors. He stood up and walked to the door, opening it cautiously. Standing on the porch was a man Michael recognized from town, Pastor John Williams, the minister of the small church where the Thompsons had worshipped for years. The pastor was a kind, elderly man, with a white beard and gentle eyes that had seen more than their fair share of sorrow. "Evening, Michael," Pastor John said with a nod. "May I come in?" "Of course, Pastor. Please come in," Michael replied, stepping aside to let the man enter. As Pastor John walked into the kitchen, he saw Emily wiping her eyes and offered her a comforting smile. "Emily, it's good to see you. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Pastor," she said, managing a weak smile. "What brings you here this late?" The pastor took a seat at the table, folding his hands in front of him. "I wanted to check on you both. I've noticed that you haven't been at church as often lately, and I was concerned. I know things have been difficult for your family." Michael exchanged a glance with Emily before speaking. "We've been struggling, Pastor. We're doing everything we can, but it feels like we're losing this battle." Pastor John nodded slowly. "I've seen many in our community facing similar hardships. This town is going through a dark time, and it's testing the faith of even the strongest among us. But I believe that God has not abandoned Willow Creek. He is with us, even in these trials." Emily looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to feel His presence when everything is falling apart around us." The pastor reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know, Emily. Believe me, I know. But faith is not about seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. It's about trusting that the light is there, even when you can't see it. I don't have all the answers, but I do know that you are not alone in this. Your church, your community, we're all here to support you." Michael felt a lump in his throat, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "We appreciate that, Pastor. We do. But we're at the point where we're considering leaving Willow Creek. We don't know if we can survive here much longer." Pastor John looked at him thoughtfully. "I won't tell you what to do, Michael. That decision is between you and God. But I will say this. Sometimes the darkest moments in our lives are when we are closest to a breakthrough. It's in those times that our faith is truly tested. And it's in those times that we often find the strength we didn't know we had." Michael listened, the pastor's words resonating deep within him. "But what if we don't have that strength?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The pastor smiled gently. "Then you lean on each other and you lean on God. You take it one day at a time and you keep moving forward, even when it's hard. And you remember that you don't have to face this alone." Emily squeezed Michael's hand, and he felt a surge of warmth from her touch. She looked at Pastor John with renewed resolve. "We'll keep fighting, Pastor. We won't give up. We'll stay and see this through, no matter what." Pastor John nodded, rising from his seat. "That's all you can do, Emily. And remember, if you ever need anything, prayers, support, or just someone to talk to, the church doors are always open." As he made his way to the door, Michael and Emily followed him. The pastor turned back to them with a final piece of advice. "Hold on to your faith, no matter how small it may feel right now. Faith, even as small as a mustard seed, can move mountains." With that, Pastor John left, leaving Michael and Emily standing in the doorway, the cool night air brushing against their faces. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision they had just made settling over them. Finally, Michael turned to Emily and took her hands in his. "We'll stay," he said firmly. "We'll stay and fight for our home, for our family, no matter how hard it gets." Emily nodded, her heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "We'll get through this, Michael. I know we will." That night, as they prayed together with their children, Michael and Emily felt a quiet peace settle over them. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, they felt a glimmer of hope. But as they would soon learn, the road ahead was far from easy. Willow Creek was a town that had weathered many storms, but the one that was coming would test the Thompsons and their faith like never before. The crisp autumn air brought with it a sense of change, but the hardships facing the Thompson family remained relentless. Despite their renewed resolve to stay in Willow Creek, the weight of their struggles was ever present. The mortgage payment deadline loomed, and with it the fear of losing their home. Michael rose early each morning. His body aching from the laborious work he took on to scrape together any money he could. Emily, too, continued to work long hours at the clinic, her spirit heavy with the knowledge that it still might not be enough. The children, Anna and Jacob, tried their best to remain cheerful, but even their young hearts could sense the tension that hung over their household like a storm cloud. One day, as Michael was finishing up a job repairing a neighbor's fence, an old friend approached him. Henry Lawson had been a close companion since their school days, and though life had taken them down different paths, their bond had never wavered. Henry was a man of simple means but a heart full of generosity. He ran a small farm on the outskirts of town, where he and his wife raised livestock and grew vegetables. "Michael," Henry called out as he approached, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Been meaning to catch up with you. Heard you've been having a rough go of it." Michael wiped the sweat from his brow and gave his friend a weary smile. "Yeah, you could say that, but we're managing. Just trying to keep our heads above water." Henry nodded, his expression one of understanding. "I hear you, brother. Times are tough for all of us, but I wanted to see if there was anything I could do to help. I know it's not much, but we've got more eggs and produce than we can use this season. I'd be happy to bring some by for your family." The offer, though modest, touched Michael deeply. He knew Henry wasn't wealthy by any means, and yet here he was, offering what little he had to help a friend in need. "Henry, I can't thank you enough. That would mean the world to us, really. But I don't want to put you out." "Nonsense," Henry replied with a wave of his hand. "We're all in this together, Michael. No one in Willow Creek gets through these times alone. I'll bring some over tomorrow morning." True to his word, Henry arrived the next day with a basket full of fresh eggs, vegetables, and even a jar of honey. Emily was moved to tears by the kindness, and the children's eyes lit up at the sight of the bounty. "Thank you, Henry," Emily said as she accepted the basket. "You have no idea how much this means to us." "Just paying it forward," Henry said with a warm smile. "If you need anything else, you just let me know." The small gesture of generosity sparked something in Michael and Emily, a reminder that they were not alone in their struggle. Despite the dire circumstances, there were still good people in the world, willing to lend a hand without expecting anything in return. As the days passed, Michael found himself thinking more and more about the church. They had been so consumed by their own troubles that they had drifted away from the community that had always been their source of strength. One Sunday, Michael decided it was time to go back. "Let's go to church tomorrow," he suggested to Emily one evening as they sat together after dinner. "We haven't been in a while, and I think it might help. Maybe we can find some peace there, even if just for a little while." Emily looked at him, her eyes softening. "I think that's a good idea. We need to reconnect with our faith and our friends." The following morning, the Thompsons dressed in their Sunday best, clothes that had grown a bit worn over the years, but were still neatly pressed. As they walked into the small church, they were greeted with warm smiles and hugs from familiar faces. Pastor John was there to welcome them, his eyes twinkling with the warmth that only years of guiding his flock could bring. The service was a simple one, with hymns sung by the congregation and a sermon that spoke of perseverance through trials. As Michael sat beside Emily, holding her hand, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't that their problems had disappeared, but being in that sacred space, surrounded by their community, gave him a renewed sense of strength. After the service, as they mingled with the other churchgoers, Pastor John approached them. "It's good to see you back," he said with a smile. "I've been praying for your family every day." "Thank you, Pastor," Michael replied. "We appreciate that more than you know." Pastor John hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "I want to offer you something, Michael. We have a fund at the church for families who are struggling. It's not much, but it could help with your mortgage payment this month." Michael was taken aback by the offer. He had never been one to accept charity, always preferring to work for what he had. But as he looked into Pastor John's eyes, he saw not pity, but genuine concern. I don't know what to say," Michael stammered. "We've never asked for help like this before." "There's no shame in accepting help when it's offered," the pastor said gently. "You've always been there for others, Michael. Now it's our turn to be there for you." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. He glanced at Emily, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Thank you, Pastor," Michael finally said, his voice thick with emotion. This means more to us than you can imagine." As they left the church that day, the Thompsons felt a burden lifted from their shoulders. The money from the church fund wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought them time. Time to catch their breath, to regroup, and to find a way forward. But just as the flicker of hope began to brighten, another shadow loomed on the horizon. Michael received a call from the factory where he had once worked part-time during the busy seasons. The new owner, who had taken over after the factory's closure, was planning to reopen, but only with a fraction of the previous workforce. "Michael, I hate to say it," the man on the other end of the line said, "but there won't be a spot for you. We're only bringing back a handful of the old crew, and the rest will have to find work elsewhere." Michael felt his heart sink. He had been counting on the possibility of returning to the factory, even if just part-time, to help make ends meet. Now that door was closing too. After hanging up the phone, Michael sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the latest setback pressing down on him like a physical force. Emily found him there, his head in his hands, and without a word, she sat down beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We'll figure something out," she whispered, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "We always do." But Michael wasn't so sure this time. The constant barrage of bad news was wearing him down, chipping away at the faith he had clung to so desperately. He knew he needed to be strong for his family, but how much more could one man take? As the days turned into weeks, Michael found himself retreating into his own thoughts more and more. The pressure of their situation was suffocating, and the fear of losing everything they had worked for was a constant gnawing at his soul. He tried to keep up a brave face for Emily and the kids, but inside, he felt like he was slowly unraveling. One cold, gray afternoon, as he walked the familiar path through the woods behind their house, a place he had often gone to clear his mind, Michael fell to his knees, overcome with despair. He looked up at the sky, the clouds heavy and foreboding, and for the first time in his life, he shouted in anger, "Why, God? Why is this happening to us? What did we do to deserve this?" His voice echoed through the trees, the raw emotion in it startling even to his own ears. There was no answer, no sudden revelation or divine sign, just the rustling of leaves and the distant cry of a bird. Michael felt the tears stream down his face, the pent-up frustration and sorrow finally breaking free. For what felt like hours, he knelt there, letting the weight of his burdens pour out in silent sobs. When he finally stood, his body trembling from the cold and the release of emotion, he felt a strange sense of calm. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held. But standing there in the stillness of the woods, Michael realized that he couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. His family needed him. They were counting on him to lead them through this dark time, to keep their faith alive even when it seemed like all hope was lost. And somehow, in that moment, Michael found the strength to keep going. As he walked back to the house, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the path ahead. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but to Michael, it felt like a sign. A promise that even in the darkest of times, there was still light to be found. When he returned home, he found Emily and the children in the living room, huddled together under a blanket, reading a book. They looked up as he entered, and Emily smiled at him, a look of quiet relief on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, sensing the shift in his demeanor. Michael nodded, his heart swelling with love for the family that had been his anchor through every storm. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I think I am." And as he sat down beside them, wrapping his arms around his wife and children, Michael knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And that, he realized, was enough. But the challenges they had faced so far were only the beginning. The real test of their faith and resilience was yet to come. The first snow of winter fell lightly over Willow Creek, covering the small town in a blanket of white. The air was crisp, and the cold seemed to cut through even the thickest coats. Yet, despite the beauty of the season, the Thompson family's struggles continued to deepen. Michael and Emily had managed to make the last mortgage payment, thanks to the church's assistance and Henry's generosity. But the relief was temporary. As the snow piled up outside, so did the bills on their kitchen table. The heating costs soared as the temperatures dropped, and the repairs the old house needed to keep the cold at bay were beyond their means. The children, Anna and Jacob, could sense their parents' growing anxiety, even as Michael and Emily did their best to shield them from the worst of it. Christmas was approaching, a time that usually brought joy and warmth to their home. But this year, the holiday season felt like a cruel reminder of everything they were about to lose. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Michael and Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the faint howl of wind outside. "We're running out of time," Michael said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "We need a miracle, Emily. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Emily's eyes were filled with worry, but she tried to remain optimistic. "Maybe something will come through. Maybe a job or—" Her voice trailed off, the weight of their situation making it hard to finish the sentence. Michael looked at her, his heart breaking at the sight of the woman he loved so much trying to hold on to hope. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly. "Maybe we should sell some of our things. The car's no good anymore, but we could sell it for parts. Maybe we could sell the furniture or some of the tools from the shed." Emily frowned. "Michael, we've worked so hard for everything we have. Selling it off piece by piece. It feels like we're giving up." "I know," Michael admitted, his voice tinged with sadness. "But what choice do we have? If we don't do something, we're going to lose the house. And if that happens, where will we go?" Emily was silent for a long moment, her mind racing. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right. We have to do whatever it takes to keep this roof over our heads, even if it means selling off what little we have left." The decision was made, but it felt like another piece of their lives was slipping away. The next day, Michael began making calls, trying to find buyers for the car parts, the tools, and anything else that might bring in some money. The offers were meager, but every little bit counted. As the days passed, the Thompsons began to see their home slowly empty of the possessions that had once filled it with warmth and comfort. The couch where the family had spent so many evenings together was sold, leaving the living room bare. The kitchen table, where they had shared countless meals, was taken by a neighbor who promised to put it to good use. Despite the sacrifice, it still wasn't enough. The mortgage was due again, and they were short by more than they could possibly scrape together. Michael worked from dawn until well after dark, but it seemed like no amount of effort would be enough to save them from the inevitable. It was during this time that a letter arrived, addressed to Michael. It was from the bank, and its contents made his heart sink. They were being given a final warning. If they couldn't make the full payment by the end of the month, the house would be foreclosed, and they would be forced to leave. Michael didn't know how to tell Emily. He didn't want to break her spirit, not when she was already struggling to hold everything together. But there was no way to hide the truth from her. That night, as they sat together in the cold, sparsely furnished living room, Michael handed her the letter. Emily read it in silence, her face growing paler with each word. When she finished, she looked up at Michael, her eyes filled with tears. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Michael wished he had an answer, but all he could do was pull her into his arms and hold her as she wept. The weight of their situation pressed down on him like never before, and for the first time he felt truly helpless. The days that followed were some of the darkest the Thompsons had ever faced. The once vibrant home was now a shell of what it had been, and the constant worry about where they would go if they lost it consumed their every thought. As Christmas approached, Emily tried to keep some semblance of normalcy for the children. She decorated a small tree they had cut from the woods behind their house, and she baked cookies using the last of their flour and sugar. But even these simple joys were overshadowed by the looming threat of losing their home. One evening, as the family sat together in the dimly lit living room, Anna asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Are we going to lose our house, Daddy?" Michael looked at his daughter, his heart aching. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. Instead, he said the only thing he could. "We're doing everything we can, sweetheart. We're going to keep praying and keep hoping for a miracle." Anna seemed to accept his answer, but the worry in her eyes was unmistakable. Even Jacob, who was usually so full of energy, seemed subdued, as if the weight of the situation was too much for his young mind to comprehend. That night, after the children were asleep, Michael and Emily sat by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers. They had both prayed more in the past few weeks than they ever had before, but still it felt like their prayers were going unanswered. "Maybe this is it," Emily said quietly, her voice filled with resignation. "Maybe we're not meant to stay here." Michael shook his head, refusing to accept it. "No, we can't give up, Emily. We fought too hard for this. There has to be a way." But deep down, Michael wasn't sure how much more they could take. The constant struggle, the fear of the unknown, the feeling of being trapped, it was all taking a toll on him, and he could see it wearing on Emily as well. As they sat in silence, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the room. Michael couldn't help but feel that the storm outside was a reflection of the one raging within him. And then, as if in answer to their silent pleas, there was a knock at the door. Michael and Emily exchanged a look, both of them startled by the unexpected visitor. It was late, and they weren't expecting anyone. Michael stood and walked to the door, opening it cautiously. Standing on the porch, bundled against the cold, was a man Michael didn't recognize. He was tall, with graying hair and a kind face, though it was lined with age and worry. The man looked at Michael with a hesitant smile. "Evening," the stranger said, his breath visible in the cold air. "My name's Charles Whitaker. I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, but I've heard about your situation, and I wanted to see if there's anything I can do to help." Michael frowned, unsure of what to make of the man. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Whitaker, but I'm not sure how you could help us." Charles nodded, seeming to understand Michael's hesitation. "I run a charity organization in the next town over. We help families who are struggling, especially around the holidays. I heard about what you've been going through from Pastor John, and I wanted to see if there was any way we could assist you." Michael was taken aback by the offer. He had always been a man who prided himself on his independence, on being able to provide for his family without relying on others. But now, with the reality of their situation closing in, he found himself considering the stranger's words. "We're in a tough spot," Michael admitted, his voice heavy with the burden he carried. "But I'm not sure we can accept charity. We've always tried to make it on our own." Charles smiled gently. "I understand that, Michael, and I respect it. But sometimes even the strongest among us need a little help. It's not about charity. It's about community. About people coming together to lift each other up when times are hard." Michael hesitated, then glanced back at Emily, who was watching from the doorway, her face filled with uncertainty. She gave him a small nod, silently urging him to accept the offer. Finally, Michael turned back to Charles and nodded. "All right, we could use some help." Charles smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that. We can start with the immediate needs, food, heating oil, things like that. And we'll see what else we can do to get you through this." The relief that washed over Michael was almost overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe they weren't as alone in this battle as they had thought. As Charles left, promising to return the next day with supplies, Michael closed the door and turned to Emily. She was already in tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Maybe this is our miracle," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as he whispered back, "Maybe it is." But as much as they wanted to believe that things were finally turning around, they both knew that the road ahead was still uncertain. The assistance from Charles and his organization was a blessing, but it wasn't a permanent solution. The mortgage was still due, and the future of their home was still very much in jeopardy. Yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, the Thompsons went to bed with a small sense of peace. They didn't have all the answers, but they had something they hadn't had in a long time. Hope. And sometimes, hope was enough to keep going, even in the darkest of times. But as winter deepened, and the full force of the storm gathered, the Thompsons would soon find themselves facing the greatest test of all. The weeks that followed Charles Whitaker's visit brought a flurry of activity and cautious optimism to the Thompson household. True to his word, Charles and his charity organization provided the family with the essentials they so desperately needed: heating oil, food, and even warm blankets for the children. The immediate threat of cold and hunger was alleviated, and for the first time in months, Michael and Emily could breathe a little easier. But despite the relief, the looming deadline for the mortgage payment cast a shadow over their days. They knew that if they couldn't come up with the money, the small respite they'd been granted would be short-lived. The kindness of Charles and the community had bought them time, but not a solution. Winter's grip on Willow Creek tightened as Christmas approached. The town, though blanketed in snow, seemed weighed down by the collective worries of its residents. Many families were struggling, and the once vibrant holiday season was muted by the hardships that had settled over the community. Despite this, Emily was determined to make Christmas special for Anna and Jacob. The tree in the living room, though smaller than in years past, was decorated with homemade ornaments and strings of popcorn. The children's laughter filled the house as they crafted decorations from paper and bits of ribbon, and Emily baked what she could with the ingredients they had. Michael, however, found it hard to join in the festivities. Each day brought him closer to the foreclosure deadline, and with every passing hour, his anxiety grew. He continued to work tirelessly, taking on any job that came his way, but it was never enough. The weight of his family's future rested heavily on his shoulders, and he felt powerless to change their fate. One evening, just days before Christmas, Michael sat alone in the living room after everyone had gone to bed. The glow of the Christmas tree lights cast soft shadows across the walls, and the quiet of the night pressed in on him. He stared at the stack of bills on the table, knowing that no amount of work could cover what they owed. For the first time in his life, Michael felt truly defeated. The hope that had sustained him was slipping away, replaced by a deep, gnawing despair. He had always prided himself on being a man who could provide for his family, who could overcome any challenge. But now he felt as though he had failed them. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the front door creaked open slightly, and Michael looked up to see Anna peeking in. She was clutching a worn stuffed bear, her small face framed by the soft glow of the tree lights. "Daddy?" she whispered, stepping into the room. "Why are you still up?" Michael forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking, sweetheart. Shouldn't you be in bed?" Anna nodded, but instead of returning to her room, she walked over to her father and climbed into his lap. She rested her head against his chest, her voice quiet and full of concern. "Are you sad, Daddy?" Michael wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "A little, maybe," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But don't you worry about that. You just focus on getting some sleep. Okay?" Anna was silent for a moment. Then she looked up at him with those wide, innocent eyes that always melted his heart. "I know things are hard, Daddy, but Mommy says we should keep praying. She says God is listening, even when it doesn't feel like it." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't realized how much of the burden Anna had been carrying, how much she understood about their situation. He kissed the top of her head, feeling a surge of love for his little girl. "Your mommy's right," he said softly. "We have to keep praying and we have to keep believing. We'll get through this, Anna. I promise." Anna snuggled closer to him, and within minutes, she was fast asleep in his arms. Michael sat there, holding his daughter and watching the twinkling lights on the tree, feeling a deep sense of both love and fear. He didn't know how they were going to keep that promise, but he knew he had to try. The next morning, Michael woke up early, determined to find a solution. He couldn't bear the thought of his family losing their home, not when they had come so far. He made a decision. He would go to the bank and speak to the manager directly, to plead for more time, to ask for anything that might help them stay in their home. Emily supported his decision, though she was nervous. The thought of losing the house had been gnawing at her as well, and the idea of Michael going to the bank was their last hope. She packed him a small lunch and kissed him goodbye, her eyes filled with worry. "Whatever happens," she said, her voice trembling, "just know that we'll get through it together, no matter what." Michael nodded, squeezing her hand before heading out into the cold morning. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked through the town, his breath visible in the frigid air. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he had to try. When he reached the bank, he hesitated for a moment before pushing open the heavy glass doors. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside, but it did little to ease the tension in his chest. He approached the front desk and asked to speak with the manager. After a few minutes of waiting, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a tired expression stepped out to greet him. "Michael Thompson, is it?" the manager asked, extending a hand. "Yes, sir," Michael replied, shaking his hand. "Thank you for seeing me." The manager gestured for Michael to follow him to his office, where they sat across from each other at a large oak desk. The room was decorated with framed photos of the town's history, but Michael barely noticed them. His mind was racing with the words he needed to say. "How can I help you today, Mr. Thompson?" the manager asked, leaning back in his chair. Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm here about our mortgage. I know we're behind and I know we've already been given extra time, but we need more time. We've been doing everything we can, working every day, but it's just not enough." The manager's expression remained neutral, though there was a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "I understand your situation, Mr. Thompson, and I want to help, but the bank has procedures we have to follow. We've already extended the deadline once, and there's only so much we can do." Michael felt his heart sink, but he pressed on. "I'm not asking for a handout. I just need a little more time to get the money together. We're so close, but if we lose the house now, I don't know what we'll do." The manager sighed, tapping his fingers on the desk as he considered Michael's words. "I wish I could give you better news, but the reality is that the bank has its limits. I can put in a request for an extension, but I can't guarantee it will be approved." Michael's shoulders slumped in defeat. He had hoped for something more, something that would give them the breathing room they needed, but it seemed that hope was slipping away. "Is there anything else I can do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The manager looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "There might be one other option, but it's not ideal. You could consider refinancing the mortgage. It would lower your monthly payments, but it would extend the loan term and increase the total amount you owe in the long run." Michael considered the option. It wasn't what he had hoped for, but it was better than losing the house entirely. "How long would the process take?" he asked. "It could take a few weeks, maybe more," the manager replied, "and it would require you to start making payments again immediately, even before the refinancing is finalized. You'd have to be sure you can meet those payments." Michael nodded slowly, weighing the decision in his mind. It was a risk, but it might be their only chance to keep the house. I think we'll have to do it," he said finally. The manager nodded in understanding. "I'll get the paperwork started, but you'll need to come in with your wife to finalize everything. And remember, there's no guarantee it will be approved." "I understand," Michael replied. "Thank you." As he left the bank, Michael felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The refinancing option was a lifeline, but it was also a gamble. They would have to scrape together the money to make the payments, even before the process was complete, and there was no certainty that it would work out in their favor. When he returned home, Emily was waiting for him by the window, her face etched with worry. Michael took her hands and explained what the bank manager had said, the option they had been given. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's something. We'll need to make the payments right away, even before it's finalized. But if we can do that, we might be able to keep the house." Emily listened carefully, her brow furrowed in thought. "It's risky," she said, "but it might be our only chance." Michael nodded. "We'll need to work harder than ever, and we'll have to make every dollar count. But if we can pull this off, we might just make it." The days that followed were a blur of activity. Michael took on every job he could find, no matter how small or far away, while Emily worked extra shifts at the clinic, often staying late into the night. They sold the last of their valuable possessions and tightened their belts even further, cutting back on everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Christmas came and went quietly, without the usual festivities. The children, though disappointed, seemed to understand that this year was different. Instead of gifts, they received the gift of their parents' determination and love, and they clung to that as their family's strength. As the end of the year approached, Michael and Emily managed to scrape together the money for the first payment. They went to the bank together, signed the necessary paperwork, and handed over the hard-earned cash with a mixture of hope and trepidation. But the process of refinancing was slow, and as the days turned into weeks, the pressure continued to build. The uncertainty of their situation weighed heavily on them, and the fear of losing everything they had worked for never left their minds. Then, one cold January morning, Michael received a call from the bank. The refinancing had been approved. The relief that flooded through him was indescribable. He thanked the manager profusely and immediately called Emily to share the news. They had done it. They had managed to keep their home, at least for now. When Michael returned home that evening, the sense of relief was palpable. The children, though not fully understanding the details, sensed the change in their parents' demeanor and joined in the celebration. That night, as they sat together by the fireplace, Michael and Emily held each other close, the warmth of the fire a reflection of the warmth in their hearts. They had weathered the storm, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, they knew they had the strength to face whatever came next. But as they would soon discover, the trials they had faced so far were only the beginning. The true test of their faith and resilience was still to come, and it would challenge them in ways they could never have imagined. Winter lingered over Willow Creek like a stubborn guest who refused to leave. Although the immediate threat of losing their home had been averted, the Thompson family remained on edge. The relief of securing the refinancing had been real, but the fear that something else could go wrong was never far from their minds. Michael and Emily knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a moment. The daily grind continued, and although they were managing to keep up with the new mortgage payments, it came at a steep cost. Michael's body was worn down from the constant labor, his hands rough and calloused, his back aching from the long hours spent bending, lifting, and working in the cold. Emily, too, was exhausted from the late nights at the clinic, where she took on as many shifts as she could to bring in extra income. The stress was beginning to show on both of them, in the deep lines etched into their faces and the weight they had lost from skipped meals and sleepless nights. The children, Anna and Jacob, were resilient, but even their young hearts were strained by the tension in the household. They had learned not to ask for things they knew their parents couldn't afford, and they often spent their evenings quietly, trying not to add to the burden their mother and father carried. Despite their efforts to shield the children, Michael and Emily knew that their struggles were affecting them in ways they couldn't fully see. One evening in late January, after a particularly grueling day of work, Michael came home to find Emily sitting alone in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. The sight of her made his heart sink. She had been pushing herself too hard, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the strain took its toll. "Emily?" he called softly as he set down his work bag and walked over to her. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just tired, that's all." Michael wasn't convinced. He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "You've been running yourself ragged, Em. We both have. But you can't keep this up. It's wearing you down." Emily forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We don't have a choice, Michael. We have to keep going. For the kids. For us. There's no other way." Michael sighed, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. He knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier to see her like this. "Maybe we need to take a step back," he suggested gently. "Find a way to lighten the load, even just a little." Emily shook her head, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. "And do what, Michael? Cut back on work? We can't afford that. We're barely holding on as it is." "I know," Michael said quietly, "but if we don't take care of ourselves, we're going to break. And then what happens to the kids? We need to be strong for them." Emily's expression softened, and she squeezed his hands. "You're right, but I don't know how to stop. It feels like if I slow down, even for a moment, everything will come crashing down around us." Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if he could somehow absorb her pain. "We'll figure it out," he murmured into her hair. "We'll find a way." But the truth was, Michael didn't know how they would find that way. Every day felt like a balancing act, and the slightest misstep could send them tumbling into disaster. They were caught in a vicious cycle of survival, and the toll it was taking on their bodies, minds, and spirits was becoming harder to ignore. As the winter months dragged on, the pressure continued to mount. The bills kept coming, the work was relentless, and the exhaustion that had settled into their bones was unshakable. It was as if the storm they had been bracing for hadn't passed, but was only gathering strength. One particularly harsh February night, a blizzard swept through Willow Creek, burying the town under several feet of snow. The power lines were downed by the weight of the ice, plunging the town into darkness. The Thompsons huddled together in the living room, wrapped in blankets, with only the flickering light of a few candles to break the oppressive blackness. Michael sat with his arms around the children, trying to keep them warm as the temperature in the house plummeted. Emily was beside him, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the candles. Despite the cold, she smiled at the children, trying to keep their spirits up. "It's like camping, isn't it?" she said, her voice cheerful despite the shivering. "We'll have to tell stories and pretend we're in a cozy little cabin in the woods." Anna and Jacob nodded, their eyes wide with excitement, even though their teeth chattered from the cold. Michael admired Emily's ability to make the best of a bad situation, but he couldn't shake the gnawing worry in his gut. The storm was brutal, and with no power, no heat, and dwindling supplies, he wasn't sure how long they could last. As the night wore on, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the old house to its foundation. The cold seeped into every corner, and despite their best efforts, Michael could feel the chill creeping into his bones. He glanced over at Emily, noticing the paleness of her skin and the way she hugged herself, trying to stay warm. They couldn't go on like this. The storm wasn't letting up, and the house was becoming dangerously cold. Michael knew he had to do something, but with the roads impassable and the power out, their options were limited. Finally, Michael made a decision. He leaned over to Emily and whispered, "We need to get the kids to a warmer place. Henry's farm isn't too far, and they have a wood-burning stove. They might be able to help us until the storm passes." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with concern. "But how will we get there? The roads are buried under snow, and the wind is so strong." "We'll have to walk," Michael said, his voice firm with resolve. "It's not safe to stay here, not with the power out. I'll bundle the kids up, and we'll make it, I promise." Emily hesitated, clearly terrified at the prospect of venturing out into the storm, but she knew Michael was right. Staying in the freezing house could be just as dangerous, if not more so. Without another word, Michael stood and began gathering blankets, coats, and anything else that could help keep them warm on the journey. He wrapped Anna and Jacob in layers of clothing, their small bodies almost disappearing under the thick layers. "It's going to be an adventure," Michael told them, forcing a smile. "We're going to Henry's farm, where it's nice and warm, but we have to be brave and stick together. Okay?" The children nodded, though their eyes were wide with fear. Emily joined Michael in bundling up, her hands shaking as she pulled on her coat. She glanced around the house, as if trying to commit it to memory, in case they never returned. When they were ready, Michael led the way out the front door, holding Anna's hand tightly in his. Emily followed close behind, carrying Jacob, who was already beginning to nod off from the cold and exhaustion. The moment they stepped outside, the wind hit them like a wall of ice. It was so strong that it nearly knocked Michael off his feet, and the snow swirled around them in blinding flurries. The path ahead was almost invisible, but Michael knew the way to Henry's farm well, and he guided his family as best as he could. The walk was grueling. Each step felt like a battle against the elements, and the cold was so intense that it stung their skin, even through the layers of clothing. The children whimpered in fear and discomfort, but Michael and Emily kept encouraging them, urging them to keep going. After what felt like an eternity, they finally saw the faint outline of Henry's farmhouse through the snow. The sight gave them the burst of energy they needed to push forward, and they staggered toward the warm light that glowed faintly from the windows. When they reached the door, Michael pounded on it, his frozen hands barely making a sound. But within moments, the door was flung open, and Henry stood there, his face a mixture of shock and concern. "Michael! Emily! What are you doing out in this storm?" he exclaimed, ushering them inside. "You must be frozen to the bone." "We couldn't stay at the house," Michael explained, his teeth chattering. "The power's out and it was getting too cold. We didn't know where else to go." Henry didn't hesitate. He and his wife, Margaret, quickly helped the Thompsons out of their wet, icy clothing and wrapped them in warm blankets. The children were placed in front of the roaring fire, where Margaret fussed over them, rubbing their hands and feet to bring the warmth back. As they sat by the fire, slowly thawing out, Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude for Henry and Margaret's kindness. The warmth of the fire seeped into his bones, and for the first time since the storm had started, he felt a flicker of hope. But as they warmed up and the adrenaline of the journey wore off, Michael noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Emily, who had been sitting quietly beside him, wasn't looking well. Her face was flushed, but she was shivering uncontrollably, and when she tried to stand, she swayed unsteadily. "Emily?" Michael said, his voice filled with concern. "Are you all right?" Emily shook her head, and Michael could see the fear in her eyes. "I don't feel so good," she whispered, her voice weak. Henry and Margaret exchanged worried glances, and Margaret immediately moved to Emily's side, placing a hand on her forehead. "She's burning up," Margaret said, her voice tense. "It might be the cold, or it could be something else." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside Emily, taking her hands in his. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said urgently. "We need to get you help." Henry nodded, already moving to put on his coat. "There's a clinic in the next town," he said. "It's a bit of a drive in this weather, but it's the closest place." Margaret grabbed Michael's arm, her voice filled with worry. "You stay with the children. I'll go with Henry and Emily to the clinic. We'll get her there as fast as we can." Michael wanted to argue, wanted to be the one to take Emily, but he knew Margaret was right. The children needed him, and with the storm still raging outside, they couldn't be left alone. As Henry and Margaret helped Emily into her coat, Michael hugged her tightly, his heart aching with fear. "Hold on, Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We'll get you through this. I love you." Emily nodded, tears in her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered back, before turning to follow Henry and Margaret out the door. As the door closed behind them, Michael sank to his knees in front of the fire, his mind racing with worry. He could hear the wind howling outside, and he prayed with all his heart that they would make it to the clinic safely, and that Emily would be all right. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Michael's life. He sat by the fire with the children, trying to keep them warm and calm, but his mind was far away with Emily. He kept glancing at the clock, counting the minutes, hoping for any sign of their return. But as the night wore on, the storm grew worse, and there was no sign of Henry's truck. The wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets, burying the world in white. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, Michael heard the sound of a truck engine struggling through the snow. He rushed to the window and saw the faint outline of Henry's truck pulling into the driveway, covered in snow. He ran to the door, flinging it open just as Henry and Margaret emerged, helping a weak and shivering Emily out of the truck. "She's got pneumonia," Henry said, his voice grim. "The doctor said it's bad, but we got her there in time. They gave her medicine, but she needs rest and warmth. Lots of it." Michael felt a wave of relief mixed with fear as he helped them bring Emily inside. She was pale and trembling, but she managed a weak smile when she saw him. "You're going to be all right," Michael said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're going to be just fine." But as they laid Emily down by the fire, bundling her in blankets and trying to bring her body temperature up, Michael knew that their battle was far from over. The storm outside had subsided, but the storm within their lives was still raging, and Emily's illness was a harsh reminder of how fragile their situation was. The days that followed were a blur of worry and care. Michael and the children stayed at Henry's farm, where they could keep warm and safe, while Margaret and Michael tended to Emily. The medicine helped, but Emily was weak, and it would be a long road to recovery. Through it all, Michael felt a deep sense of helplessness. He was used to being the one who took care of things, who made sure everything was all right. But now, all he could do was watch and wait, and pray that Emily's strength would return. And as the days stretched into weeks, Michael realized that the true test of their faith was just beginning. They had weathered the storm, but the real battle was far from over. The days stretched into weeks as Emily's recovery slowly progressed. The winter still clung stubbornly to Willow Creek, but the Thompson family found a small refuge at Henry and Margaret's farm. It was a simple life, but for now it was safe and warm, a much-needed contrast to the chaos that had engulfed their lives over the past months. Emily remained weak, spending most of her time resting by the fire. The pneumonia had taken a heavy toll on her body, and although the medicine was helping, the road to recovery was longer than any of them had anticipated. Michael stayed by her side as much as possible, caring for her with a tenderness that reflected his deep love and fear for her well-being. Despite his exhaustion, Michael continued to work whenever he could, determined not to fall behind on the mortgage payments. He took on whatever jobs he could find, often working long hours and returning to the farm late at night. His body ached from the relentless labor, but he pushed through the pain, driven by the need to provide for his family. But as the weeks passed, the strain of their situation became more apparent. Michael's face grew gaunt, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He often found himself staring into the distance, lost in thought, consumed by worry for Emily and the future of their family. The burden of their circumstances weighed heavily on him, and he began to feel the cracks in his resolve widening. One particularly cold evening, as Michael returned to the farm after a long day of work, he found Margaret sitting by Emily's bedside, her expression one of deep concern. Emily was pale and listless, her breathing shallow as she slept. Margaret looked up as Michael entered the room, her face lined with worry. "She's not improving as quickly as we'd hoped," she said quietly, her voice tinged with fear. "The doctor says she needs more rest, more time, but I'm worried, Michael. She's so weak." Michael's heart tightened in his chest as he knelt beside Emily, taking her hand in his. Felt cold, fragile. "What else can we do?" he asked, his voice strained. "We've done everything the doctor said." Margaret shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. "All we can do is wait and pray. But Michael, you need to take care of yourself too. You can't keep running yourself into the ground like this. Emily needs you to be strong, and so do the children." Michael nodded, but the words offered little comfort. He felt as though he were walking a tightrope, teetering on the edge of collapse. The constant pressure, the fear of losing everything, was eating away at him. But he couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not when Emily and the children were depending on him. As the night wore on, Michael stayed by Emily's side, watching her sleep. The faint rise and fall of her chest was a fragile reminder of the life that still clung to her, and he couldn't shake the fear that it might slip away at any moment. He prayed silently, his hands clenched in desperation, pleading for the strength to keep going, for the miracle that seemed so elusive. But as the hours passed, exhaustion finally overcame him, and he fell into a restless sleep beside Emily's bed. The next morning, Michael was woken by the soft sound of voices. He opened his eyes to find Anna and Jacob standing at the foot of the bed, their small faces filled with concern as they watched their mother. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" Anna asked, her voice trembling with fear. Michael sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He reached out to pull the children into his arms, holding them close. "She's going to be fine," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "She just needs to rest. But she's getting better, I promise." The children clung to him, their trust in his words giving him a small measure of comfort. But as he held them, Michael knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. He was running on empty, and the constant stress was taking its toll. He needed help, but he didn't know where to turn. Later that day, as Michael sat outside on the porch, lost in thought, Henry joined him. The older man's presence was a calming one, and Michael felt a flicker of relief at the company. "You're carrying a lot on your shoulders, Michael," Henry said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you can't do this alone. We're all here to help you, Margaret, the kids, even the folks in town. You just need to let us in." Michael sighed, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "I don't know how to ask for help, Henry. I've always been the one who provides, who takes care of things. But now it feels like everything is slipping away, and I don't know how to stop it." Henry placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. "You're not failing, Michael. You're doing everything you can, and that's all anyone can ask of you. But you're only human. You need to lean on others when the load gets too heavy. That's what family and friends are for." Michael looked out at the snow-covered fields, the stark beauty of the landscape contrasting with the turmoil inside him. "I just want to keep my family safe," he said quietly. "But I feel like I'm losing the fight." "You're not losing," Henry said firmly. "You're still here, still fighting. And that's what matters. But you need to take care of yourself too. Emily needs you to be strong, and you can't do that if you're running yourself into the ground." Michael nodded, though the weight of his responsibilities still pressed heavily on him. "I know, but it's hard, Henry. Every day feels like a battle, and I'm so tired." Henry's eyes softened with understanding. "You're not alone in this, Michael. We're all in this together, and we'll get through it. You just have to trust that there's a way forward, even if you can't see it yet." Michael wanted to believe those words, wanted to hold on to the hope that had kept him going for so long. But the truth was he was losing faith in himself, in the future, even in the God he had prayed to so fervently. The relentless pressure, the constant fear of failure, was wearing him down. As the days continued to pass, Emily's condition began to slowly improve. The color returned to her cheeks, and her strength began to come back, little by little. It was a relief to see, but Michael couldn't shake the fear that had taken root in his heart. He knew they weren't out of the woods yet, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead kept him on edge. Then, one evening, as the family sat together by the fire, a knock came at the door. Michael exchanged a puzzled glance with Emily before getting up to answer it. Standing on the porch was Pastor John, bundled up against the cold. His face, though tired, was kind as he greeted Michael with a warm smile. "Good evening, Michael," the pastor said, his breath visible in the frosty air. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to check in and see how you all were doing." Michael invited the pastor inside, grateful for the visit. It had been weeks since they had last seen Pastor John, and his presence brought a sense of comfort to the room. "We're managing," Michael said, though the weariness in his voice was hard to miss. "Emily's getting better, but it's been a rough few weeks." Pastor John nodded, his expression one of deep sympathy. "I've been praying for you all every day. I know how hard things have been, and I wanted to offer my help in any way I can." Michael hesitated, the old reluctance to accept help rearing its head. But he knew deep down that they couldn't do this alone. "Not anymore." "We appreciate that, Pastor," he said finally. "We're just trying to keep going, but it feels like we're barely holding on." Pastor John's eyes softened with understanding. "Faith is a hard thing to hold on to in times like these," he said gently. "But it's in these moments that we need it the most. It's not about having all the answers, but about trusting that there's a path forward, even when we can't see it." Michael looked down, his hands clenched in his lap. "I want to believe that," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "But it's hard. So much has happened, and I feel like I'm losing faith in everything." Pastor John placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You're not alone in that, Michael. We all struggle with doubt, especially when we're faced with so much uncertainty. But remember, faith isn't about never doubting. It's about continuing to move forward, even when you're not sure of the way. The words struck a chord in Michael, and he felt a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps, or a reminder of the strength he had once felt in his faith. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. Pastor John stayed for a while longer, talking with the family, offering words of encouragement and support. By the time he left, the atmosphere in the house had lightened, if only a little. But as the night wore on and the house grew quiet, Michael found himself sitting by the fire, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered. The fear and doubt still gnawed at him, but there was also a small, fragile light of hope, one that he hadn't felt in a long time. Emily, sensing his turmoil, came to sit beside him, slipping her hand into his. She was still weak, but there was a strength in her touch that gave Michael comfort. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but we will. We've come this far, and we're not going to give up now." Michael looked at her, seeing the resolve in her eyes. She had been through so much, had fought so hard to come back from the brink, and her strength gave him the courage he needed. "We'll make it through this," he said, his voice steady. "We have to." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael began to believe it. The journey ahead was still uncertain, the challenges still daunting, but they had each other. They had their faith, however fragile it might be, and sometimes that was enough. As the fire burned low and the house settled into quiet slumber, Michael allowed himself to hope. It was a small thing, a fragile light in the darkness, but it was there, and for now that was enough. But as they would soon discover, the trials were far from over. The darkest hour was yet to come, and it would test everything they had left. The days began to lengthen as winter loosened its grip on Willow Creek. Though the snow was still piled high against the houses and along the roads, there was a subtle change in the air, a hint of spring that brought with it a glimmer of hope. For the Thompsons, however, the promise of a new season did little to ease the burden of their ongoing struggles. Emily's health continued to improve, albeit slowly. She was able to sit up more often, and sometimes even manage a few steps around the house. But the illness had taken a toll on her that couldn't be easily undone. Michael, too, was beginning to show the signs of wear and tear from months of relentless work and worry. The lines on his face had deepened, and the exhaustion in his eyes was ever present. Despite these challenges, life at Henry and Margaret's farm had become a temporary refuge for the Thompsons. The close-knit environment provided a sense of security that had been missing for so long. But as the days turned into weeks, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. They were still behind on their payments, and the specter of foreclosure loomed large, casting a long shadow over every decision he made. One afternoon, as Michael was returning from yet another long day of work, he found Henry waiting for him on the porch. The older man's face was serious, and Michael's heart sank, fearing more bad news. "Michael," Henry began, his voice heavy with concern. "We need to talk." Michael braced himself, stepping up onto the porch. "What is it, Henry? What's wrong?" Henry sighed, gesturing for Michael to sit down beside him. "I've been thinking about your situation. You've been here for weeks now, and I'm glad we've been able to help you. But you can't keep going like this. You're wearing yourself down to nothing." Michael rubbed his hands together, feeling the roughness of his skin. "I know, Henry, but what choice do we have? We're barely staying afloat, and if we lose the house, I don't know what we'll do." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly why I think you need to consider other options. This town, this life, it's grinding you down, Michael. Maybe it's time to think about starting over, somewhere new." Michael stiffened at the suggestion. "Leave Willow Creek? But this is our home, Henry. It's where we've raised our kids, where we've built our lives. How can we just walk away from that?" Henry placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, his gaze steady. "Sometimes the hardest decision is the one that sets you free. I'm not saying it will be easy, but staying here, trying to hold on to something that's slipping away, it's tearing you apart. You need to think about what's best for your family, not just what's familiar." Michael was silent, the weight of Henry's words pressing down on him. The thought of leaving Willow Creek, of abandoning everything they had known, was almost too much to bear. But deep down, he knew there was truth in what Henry was saying. They had been fighting so hard to keep their heads above water, but it was becoming clear that they were drowning. As if sensing Michael's internal struggle, Henry continued, "You've got skills, Michael. You're a hard worker, and there are opportunities out there if you're willing to take the risk. It might be tough at first, but it could also be the fresh start you need." Michael leaned back, closing his eyes as he let out a long breath. The idea of starting over in a new place, away from the memories and the weight of their current life, was terrifying. But it was also tempting, a chance to leave behind the relentless pressure that had consumed them for so long. "I don't know, Henry," Michael said finally, his voice strained. "How can I even think about leaving when we're still trying to keep our home? And what about Emily and the kids? How can I ask them to just pack up and go?" Henry looked at Michael with compassion. "I'm not saying you should decide right now, but I think it's worth considering. Talk to Emily, see how she feels. Whatever you decide, just know that we're here for you, no matter what." Michael nodded, though his mind was still racing. He thanked Henry for his advice, but as he walked inside the house, his thoughts were tangled with doubt and fear. That evening, as they sat together after dinner, Michael brought up the conversation with Emily. He could see the fatigue in her eyes, the way she had to muster the energy just to listen. But she gave him her full attention, as she always did. "Henry thinks we should consider moving," Michael said, his voice hesitant. "He thinks it might be time for a fresh start, somewhere away from all this." Emily didn't respond immediately. She sat quietly, absorbing the weight of his words. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "Do you think he's right?" Michael struggled to find the answer. "I don't know. Part of me thinks he might be, but the thought of leaving, it feels like giving up, like admitting we've failed." Emily reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We haven't failed, Michael. We've done everything we can. But maybe Henry's right. Maybe we need to think about what's best for us, for the kids. Staying here, it's breaking us down. And I'm scared, Michael. I'm scared that if we keep going like this, we'll lose more than just the house." Michael's heart ached at the pain in her voice. He squeezed her hand, his own voice trembling with emotion. "I'm scared too, Em. I don't want to lose you or the kids or our life here. But I don't know what to do anymore." Emily leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Whatever we decide, we'll do it together. We'll figure it out. But maybe it's time to let go. To stop fighting a battle we can't win." Michael held her close, the tears he had been holding back finally slipping free. The weight of their struggles, the fear of the unknown, the pain of possibly leaving everything behind. It all came crashing down on him, and he wept, unable to hold it in any longer. Emily cried with him, the two of them clinging to each other as they let out the sorrow and frustration that had been building for so long. It was a moment of raw vulnerability, a breaking point that had been inevitable. But as the tears subsided, there was also a sense of release, of acceptance. They were no longer fighting against the tide. Instead, they were beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, there was another way forward. The days that followed were filled with difficult conversations and soul-searching. Michael and Emily discussed the possibility of moving, of starting over in a new town where the cost of living might be lower, where there could be new opportunities for work and a fresh start for their family. It wasn't an easy decision. The thought of leaving Willow Creek, the only home their children had ever known, was heartbreaking. But the more they talked, the more they realized that staying might mean sacrificing more than they were willing to lose. Finally, after many sleepless nights and long discussions, they made the decision. They would leave Willow Creek. It was a choice born of necessity, of the realization that sometimes letting go was the only way to survive. Michael contacted the bank, letting them know that they would be selling the house. It was a painful call, one that felt like admitting defeat. But there was also a sense of relief, of knowing that they were taking control of their fate, rather than being crushed by it. The process of selling the house was slow and filled with its own challenges. But with the help of Henry, Pastor John, and the small but tight-knit community, they managed to find a buyer, a family looking for a fresh start of their own. The final weeks in Willow Creek were bittersweet. The Thompsons packed up their belongings, sorting through memories and deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. The children struggled to understand why they had to leave their home, but Michael and Emily did their best to explain that this was a new adventure, a chance to build something new together. The day they left was cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the weight in their hearts. The townspeople gathered to say their goodbyes, offering hugs, words of encouragement, and promises to stay in touch. Michael stood on the porch of the house one last time, looking out at the town that had been their home for so long. He felt a mixture of sorrow and hope, of fear and determination. This was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. As they drove away, leaving Willow Creek behind, Michael felt a lump in his throat. He reached over and took Emily's hand, squeezing it tightly. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but also with a strength that had carried them through so much. "We'll be okay," she whispered, her voice steady. "We'll find our way." Michael nodded, his heart heavy but resolved. "We will," he said, more to himself than to her. "We will." And as they drove into the unknown, leaving behind the life they had built, they knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. But they also knew that they had each other, and that together, they could face whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to travel. And as they moved forward, the fragile light of hope began to grow, guiding them toward whatever lay beyond the horizon. The journey away from Willow Creek was both physically and emotionally exhausting. As the Thompsons drove through the snowy landscape, each mile seemed to take them further from the life they had known and deeper into an uncertain future. The children were quiet in the back seat, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and curiosity as they watched the familiar scenes of their hometown fade into the distance. Michael and Emily exchanged glances from time to time, both of them trying to remain strong for the sake of their children. But the weight of their decision was heavy on them. They had left behind the only home they had ever known, a place filled with memories of both joy and hardship. Now, they were venturing into the unknown, hoping that the choice they had made would lead to a better life. Their destination was a small town called Cedarville, located several hours away. It was a place they had heard about through one of Michael's former co-workers, who had moved there after the factory closed down. Cedarville was a quiet town, known for its tight-knit community and affordable living. It wasn't much different from Willow Creek, but it offered a fresh start, a place where they could rebuild their lives without the constant reminder of their struggles. As they drove into Cedarville, the Thompsons were greeted by the sight of a quaint little town nestled in a valley, surrounded by forests and hills. The snow-covered streets were lined with old-fashioned houses, and the town square was adorned with twinkling lights, still up from the holidays. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, and for a moment Michael felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the place where they could start over. They had arranged to rent a small house on the outskirts of town, a modest two-bedroom home that was a far cry from the one they had left behind. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean and cozy, with a yard where the children could play once the snow melted. The rent was low, and the landlord, a kindly old man named Mr. Harper, had been sympathetic to their situation, agreeing to a flexible payment plan until they could get back on their feet. As they unpacked their belongings, the reality of their new life began to set in. The house was smaller than they were used to, and the furnishings were sparse, but Michael and Emily did their best to make it feel like home. They hung up family photos, arranged the children's toys in the living room, and even put up some of the decorations they had brought from Willow Creek. But despite their efforts, the sense of loss lingered. The children missed their old home and their friends, and Michael and Emily found it hard to shake the feeling that they had left a part of themselves behind. The move had been necessary, but the wounds were still fresh, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead weighed heavily on them. The first few weeks in Cedarville were challenging. Michael struggled to find steady work, taking on odd jobs wherever he could, from fixing leaky roofs to helping out at the local grocery store. The pay was low, and the hours were long, but he was determined to do whatever it took to provide for his family. Emily, still recovering from her illness, found a part-time job at a small diner in town, working as a waitress during the lunch shift. The work was hard and the pay was meager, but it was something, a way to contribute, to keep going. The children adjusted as best they could, though they often asked when they could go back to Willow Creek, to their old school and their old friends. It broke Michael and Emily's hearts to see the confusion and sadness in their eyes, but they did their best to reassure them that Cedarville could be a good place too, that they could make new friends and build new memories. As the days passed, the Thompsons slowly began to settle into their new routine. The people of Cedarville were welcoming, if a bit reserved, and the town itself was peaceful, a far cry from the turmoil they had left behind. But even as they tried to move forward, the shadow of their past continued to haunt them. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Michael came home to find Emily sitting alone in the living room, staring at a photo of their old house in Willow Creek. The sight of her, so lost in thought, sent a pang of guilt through him. "Emily?" he said softly, sitting down beside her. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and exhaustion. "I miss it, Michael. I miss our home, our life, everything. I know we had to leave, but it still hurts." Michael reached out, taking her hand in his. "I know," he said quietly. "I miss it too, but we made the right decision. We had to think about what was best for the kids, for us. And maybe this is where we're supposed to be." Emily sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I want to believe that. I really do. But it's hard, Michael. It's hard to start over, to let go of everything we worked so hard for." Michael wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I know it is, but we'll get through this together. We've been through worse and we've come out the other side. This is just another challenge, another part of our journey." Emily nodded, though her eyes were still clouded with doubt. "I just want the kids to be happy," she whispered. "I want them to feel safe, to feel like they have a home." "They will," Michael assured her. "We'll make this place a home for them, for all of us. It'll take time, but we'll get there." But as much as Michael wanted to believe his own words, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, that the move to Cedarville had solved one problem but had opened the door to new ones. The constant struggle to make ends meet, the lingering sadness that seemed to hang over their family like a cloud. These were wounds that time alone might not heal. As the weeks turned into months, the Thompsons continued to adjust to their new life in Cedarville. Michael eventually found more stable work at a local hardware store, where his carpentry skills were put to good use. The pay was still modest, but it was enough to keep them afloat, and the routine provided a sense of stability that had been missing for so long. Emily's health continued to improve, and she began to take on more hours at the diner, slowly regaining her strength. The children started to make friends at their new school, though they still talked about Willow Creek often, the memories of their old life never far from their minds. But despite the progress they were making, there was an underlying tension that neither Michael nor Emily could ignore. The move had been necessary, but it had also taken a toll on their relationship, on their ability to communicate and support each other as they once had. The constant worry, the pressure to make this new life work, was creating a distance between them, a distance that was growing harder to bridge with each passing day. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Michael and Emily found themselves sitting in the kitchen, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Michael could feel the strain in the air, and he knew they needed to talk, but he wasn't sure how to start. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Michael, do you ever wonder if we made the right choice?" Michael looked up at her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" Emily sighed, her eyes filled with a sadness that had been building for months. "I mean, leaving Willow Creek, coming here. Do you ever wonder if we should have tried harder to stay? If maybe we gave up too soon?" The question hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He had been wrestling with his own doubts for some time, but hearing Emily voice them out loud made them all the more real. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought we were doing the right thing, that we were giving ourselves a chance to start over. But sometimes I wonder if we made the wrong choice." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I just feel so lost, Michael. I thought coming here would make things better, but it feels like we're still fighting the same battles, just in a different place. And I'm so tired, Michael. I'm tired of feeling like we're always just barely getting by. Michael reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I'm tired too, Em. But we're not alone in this. We have each other and we have the kids. We've made it this far and we'll keep going. We have to. Emily squeezed his hand, but the sadness in her eyes remained. I just wish it didn't have to be this hard, she whispered. I wish we could just be happy, without all the worry, without all the fear. Michael's heart ached at her words, at the pain he could see in her eyes. I know, Emily. I wish that too. But we can't give up. We have to keep going, for the kids, for us. Maybe things will get better, but we have to keep trying. But as the days passed, Michael and Emily found it increasingly difficult to hold on to that hope. The constant stress of their situation, the pressure to make their new life work, was slowly eroding the foundation of their relationship. They were both exhausted, both struggling to keep going, and the cracks were beginning to show. One night, after a particularly difficult day at work, Michael came home to find Emily sitting on the porch, staring out at the darkened sky. The children were inside, already asleep, and the house was eerily quiet. Emily, Michael said softly, sitting down beside her. What's on your mind? She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the stars above. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Michael, she whispered, her voice filled with despair. I don't know if I have the strength to keep going. Michael felt a cold chill run through him at her words. He had never heard Emily sound so defeated, so close to giving up. Emily, don't say that, he pleaded. We'll get through this. We always do. But Emily shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. I'm so tired, Michael. I feel like I'm drowning, like every day is a fight just to keep my head above water. And I'm scared. I'm scared that we're losing ourselves, that we're losing each other. Michael reached out, pulling her into his arms. She was shaking, her body trembling with the weight of her emotions. I'm scared too, he admitted, his voice breaking. But we can't give up, Emily. We've come too far. We have to keep fighting, for us, for the kids. Emily buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. I don't want to lose you, Michael. I don't want to lose us. But I don't know how much more I can take. Michael held her tightly, his heart breaking for the woman he loved more than anything. He wished he had the answers, wished he could take away her pain. But all he could do was hold her and pray that they would find a way through this darkness. As they sat together on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, Michael realized that the road ahead was going to be even harder than he had imagined. They had left Willow Creek in search of a better life, but the struggles they had hoped to leave behind had followed them, and now they were faced with the challenge of rebuilding not just their lives, but their relationship as well. The journey was far from over, and the challenges they faced were still daunting. But Michael knew that they couldn't do it alone. They needed each other, now more than ever, and they needed to find a way to heal the wounds that had been opened by the trials of the past year. As the night wore on, Michael and Emily eventually found their way back inside, where they held each other close, seeking comfort in the warmth of their love. It was a fragile thing, but it was still there, a light in the darkness that had yet to be extinguished. The next morning, they awoke with a renewed sense of determination. They were still tired, still burdened by the weight of their circumstances, but they were resolved to keep going. They had come too far to give up now, and they knew that the only way forward was together. The days that followed were filled with small victories and setbacks, but through it all, Michael and Emily clung to each other, refusing to let go of the hope that had brought them this far. They began to reach out more, to the people of Cedarville, to the church, to anyone who could offer support and guidance. Slowly, they began to build a new life one step at a time. But as they would soon discover, the road to healing was not a straight path. There were still challenges ahead, still wounds that needed to be mended, and the journey was far from over. As spring finally broke through the last remnants of winter, Cedarville began to reveal its charms to the Thompson family. The snow melted, giving way to vibrant green fields and blooming flowers. The town came alive with the sounds of birds chirping and children playing in the park. There was a freshness in the air that seemed to breathe new life into the small community. And for the first time since their move, the Thompsons started to feel a sense of hope. Michael and Emily had made a pact to focus on healing both their family and their relationship. They knew the journey would be long and difficult, but they were committed to taking it one step at a time. They leaned on each other more, communicating openly about their fears and concerns, and slowly, the cracks that had formed between them began to mend. The children, too, seemed to be adjusting better. Anna and Jacob were making friends at school, and their laughter, which had been so rare in the past months, began to fill the house once again. They still talked about Willow Creek, but their memories of the old town no longer brought tears, only a wistful longing that would eventually fade with time. Michael's work at the hardware store had become more stable, and he had even earned the trust of the store's owner, Mr. Bennett, who had started giving him more responsibilities. The work was steady, and though the pay was modest, it was enough to keep them going. Emily continued working at the diner, but she also began volunteering at the local church, finding solace and a sense of purpose in helping others. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Michael and Emily talked about how far they had come since leaving Willow Creek. "It's starting to feel like home, isn't it?" Emily said, her voice soft as she leaned into Michael's side. Michael nodded, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Yeah, it is. I wasn't sure we'd ever get to this point, but we're getting there. Slowly, but surely." Emily smiled, her eyes reflecting the warm glow of the setting sun. "I'm proud of us, Michael. We've been through so much, but we're still here. We're still standing." Michael kissed the top of her head, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the woman beside him. "I'm proud of us too, and I know we've still got a long way to go, but as long as we're together, we'll make it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. It was a moment of peace, a brief respite from the worries that still lingered, and they both savored it, knowing how rare such moments had been in their lives. As the days turned into weeks, the Thompsons continued to rebuild their lives. They became more involved in the community, attending church regularly and participating in town events. Cedarville was a small town, but its people were warm and welcoming, and the Thompsons slowly found their place among them. One Saturday afternoon, as the family walked through the town square, they came across a poster advertising a local fair that would be held the following weekend. It was a tradition in Cedarville, a celebration of the arrival of spring, with games, food, and music for the whole town to enjoy. "Can we go, Daddy?" Anna asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement as she read the poster. "Please." Michael smiled at her enthusiasm. "Of course we can go. It sounds like fun." Emily looked at the poster, a thoughtful expression on her face. "It'll be nice to do something like this together. We haven't really had a chance to just enjoy ourselves in a long time." Michael nodded, realizing that the fair would be the perfect opportunity for their family to unwind and have some fun, something they had sorely missed. "Let's do it," he agreed. "We could all use a break." When the day of the fair arrived, the Thompsons found themselves swept up in the festive atmosphere. The town square was transformed into a lively scene, with colorful banners strung between the buildings, stalls offering homemade treats, and the sound of laughter and music filling the air. Anna and Jacob ran ahead, eager to explore the games and rides. Michael and Emily followed, hand in hand, watching their children's joy with matching smiles. For the first time in a long while, they felt light, as if the weight they had been carrying was finally lifting. As they wandered through the fair, they came across familiar faces. Neighbors they had met over the past few months, people from the church, and even Mr. Bennett, who greeted Michael with a warm handshake. "It's good to see you all here," Mr. Bennett said with a smile. "How's everything going?" Michael nodded, feeling a genuine sense of contentment. "We're doing well, Mr. Bennett. Thanks to you and this town, we're starting to feel at home." Mr. Bennett chuckled. "Cedarville's a good place to be. You and your family are part of this community now, Michael. Don't forget that." As they continued through the fair, Michael and Emily took in the sights and sounds around them. The smell of fresh popcorn, the laughter of children, the bright colors of the carnival games. It was all so different from the life they had left behind, and yet, it felt right. Felt like they were exactly where they were meant to be. Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the fair continued under the twinkling lights, Michael and Emily found themselves sitting on a bench, watching their children ride the carousel. The music played softly in the background, and the warm breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Emily said, leaning against Michael's shoulder. Michael nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. "Yeah, it is. This is what we've been fighting for, Emily. A chance to be happy, to have moments like this." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "I'm glad we came here, Michael. I'm glad we took the chance." Michael kissed her gently, feeling the love and gratitude swelling in his chest. "Me too, Emily. Me too." As they sat there, watching their children laugh and play, Michael felt a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. They had been through so much, had faced so many challenges, but they had come out stronger on the other side. And now they had a chance to start anew, to build a life filled with joy and love. But just as they were beginning to feel settled, life threw another unexpected challenge their way. A few days after the fair, Michael was called into Mr. Bennett's office at the hardware store. The expression on Mr. Bennett's face was serious, and Michael immediately felt a knot form in his stomach. "Michael, I hate to be the bearer of bad news," Mr. Bennett began, his voice heavy with regret, "but I'm afraid the store's been struggling financially. Sales have been down and we've had to make some tough decisions. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to let you go." Michael felt as though the ground had dropped out from under him. He had finally begun to feel secure in his job, and now that stability was being ripped away from him. "Mr. Bennett, I understand," Michael said, his voice tight, "but I'm not sure what we'll do now. I was counting on this job to keep us going." Mr. Bennett's eyes were filled with sympathy. "I wish there was something more I could do, Michael. You're a good worker, and this has nothing to do with your performance. It's just the way things are right now. But I'll give you a good reference, and if things pick up, I'll be the first to call you back." Michael nodded, feeling numb as he left the office. The weight of this new setback pressed down on him, and he struggled to keep the fear at bay. He had been here before, facing uncertainty, not knowing how they would make it through. But this time, it felt even more devastating, coming just as they had begun to rebuild their lives. When Michael told Emily the news that evening, he could see the fear in her eyes, though she tried to stay strong for his sake. "We'll figure it out," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "We've been through worse, Michael. We'll get through this too." Michael nodded, though the fear gnawed at him, threatening to overwhelm the fragile hope they had been nurturing. "I'll start looking for another job right away," he said, trying to sound determined. "There has to be something out there." But as the days passed, the reality of their situation became more apparent. The job market in Cedarville was limited, and the few opportunities that did exist were either filled or offered wages too low to support their family. Michael found himself spiraling into the same dark place he had been in back in Willow Creek, desperate, fearful, and increasingly hopeless. Emily did her best to keep their spirits up, taking on extra shifts at the diner and trying to reassure the children that everything would be all right. But Michael could see the strain it was putting on her, and it broke his heart to see her struggling once again. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the tension between them finally came to a head. "Michael, we can't keep going like this," Emily said, her voice cracking with emotion. "We're barely holding on, and it's starting to feel like we're slipping back into the same place we were before. I don't know how much more of this I can take." Michael felt the frustration boiling over, his own fear and helplessness fueling his anger. "What do you want me to do, Emily?" he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "I'm trying. I'm doing everything I can, but nothing seems to be enough." Emily flinched at his tone, her eyes filling with tears. "I know you're trying, Michael, but it's not just about the job. It's about us. We're falling apart again, and I'm scared. I'm scared that we're going to lose everything we've worked so hard for." Michael's anger deflated, replaced by a crushing sense of guilt. He reached out to her, his voice softening. "Emily, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap at you. I'm scared too. But we can't give up. We've come too far to let this break us." Emily looked at him, her tears spilling over as she leaned into his embrace. "I don't want to give up, Michael. But I don't know how to keep going when everything feels so uncertain." Michael held her tightly, his own tears blurring his vision. "We'll find a way, Emily. We always do. We have to." But as they clung to each other, both of them fighting to hold onto the hope that had brought them this far, they knew that the road ahead would be filled with even more challenges. The path of healing was not a straight one, and the obstacles they faced were testing the very foundations of their love and resilience. The next morning, as Michael sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, he found himself reflecting on everything they had been through. The move to Cedarville had been a leap of faith, a chance to start over, but it had also brought with it new hardships that were threatening to undo all the progress they had made. As he stared out the window at the rising sun, Michael made a decision. They couldn't keep doing this alone. They needed help, support, and guidance from others who had faced similar challenges. It was time to reach out, to lean on the community they had begun to build in Cedarville, and to trust that they didn't have to bear the weight of their struggles alone. That day, Michael and Emily went to the church, where they met with Pastor Collins, the gentle-voiced man who had welcomed them when they first arrived in Cedarville. They shared their story with him, their journey from Willow Creek, the challenges they had faced, and the fears that were threatening to overwhelm them once again. Pastor Collins listened with compassion, his eyes reflecting the deep care he had for his congregation. When they finished, he offered them words of comfort and encouragement, reminding them that they were not alone and that the church and community were there to support them in any way they could. "We've all faced storms in our lives," Pastor Collins said, his voice steady and reassuring. "And sometimes, the weight of those storms feels like it will crush us. But you've already shown so much strength and resilience, Michael, Emily. You've come this far, and I believe you can keep going. But you don't have to do it alone. Let us help you carry that burden." As they left the church, Michael and Emily felt a sense of relief, as though a small part of the weight they had been carrying had been lifted. They knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but they also knew they had a community that cared for them, that would stand by them through thick and thin. And as they continued their journey of healing, they began to find small moments of joy and connection. Dinners with new friends, quiet walks through the blooming fields, and laughter shared with their children. These moments, though fleeting, were enough to keep them going, to remind them that life, even in its most difficult times, still held beauty and love. But just as they began to find their footing again, an unexpected visitor arrived in Cedarville, bringing with them news that would challenge everything Michael and Emily had worked for. The early summer sun shone brightly over Cedarville, casting long shadows as the days grew warmer and the town buzzed with the promise of the season. The Thompsons were beginning to settle into their new life, finding moments of peace amidst the challenges they continued to face. But just as they began to feel the ground solidify beneath their feet, the past found a way to intrude upon their fragile peace. It was on one such warm afternoon that the unexpected visitor arrived. Michael was working in the garden, planting vegetables with Jacob, while Emily and Anna were inside preparing lunch. The smell of fresh earth and the sound of Jacob's laughter had lifted Michael's spirits, reminding him of why they had fought so hard to start over. As he wiped the sweat from his brow, he heard the sound of a car pulling up the driveway. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to drop by, but something about this car, a sleek black sedan, made Michael pause. He stood up, squinting toward the car as a man stepped out. The visitor was dressed in a well-tailored suit, his expression serious as he adjusted his tie and looked around the property. "Dad, who's that?" Jacob asked, noticing the visitor and instinctively moving closer to his father. "I don't know, buddy," Michael replied, his voice cautious. "Why don't you go inside and tell your mom we have a visitor?" Jacob nodded and ran off, leaving Michael to walk toward the man, who was now approaching the house. "Can I help you?" Michael called out as he neared the man, who stopped a few feet away and offered a polite but reserved smile. Mr. Thompson, I presume? The man asked, his voice crisp and professional. That's right, Michael replied, crossing his arms as he studied the stranger. And you are? My name is Thomas Avery, the man said, extending a hand. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Margaret Henson, your wife's late aunt. The name sent a jolt through Michael. Aunt Margaret had been Emily's only living relative, a reclusive woman who had lived alone in a large house on the outskirts of Willow Creek. She had passed away a few years earlier, leaving behind a modest estate that Emily had never paid much attention to, given the turmoil of their lives at the time. Emily's aunt? Michael repeated, his brow furrowing in confusion. Why are you here now? We settled everything after she passed. Thomas nodded, his expression sympathetic. Yes, I'm aware of that. But there have been some recent developments regarding her estate that require your attention. Specifically, a matter involving an undisclosed inheritance that has only recently come to light. Michael's heart began to race as he tried to process the information. An inheritance? What are you talking about? Before Thomas could respond, Emily appeared at the door, her face pale with concern. She had overheard the conversation and quickly joined Michael's side. What's going on, Michael? Who is this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. This is Thomas Avery, Michael explained, his voice steadying as he turned to her. He says he's here about your Aunt Margaret. Apparently, there's something about her estate we didn't know about. Emily's eyes widened in surprise, and she turned to Thomas. I don't understand. We dealt with everything after she passed. What's this about an inheritance? Thomas cleared his throat, sensing their growing anxiety. I apologize for the confusion, Mrs. Thompson. The situation is somewhat complex. It appears that your aunt had a secondary will, one that was only recently discovered. In this will, she left a substantial amount of money, as well as the deed to her property, to you. Emily stared at Thomas in disbelief. But why would she do that? We weren't close. I hadn't spoken to her in years. Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's not uncommon for individuals to make arrangements that aren't immediately disclosed, especially in cases where they wish to keep certain matters private until after their passing. From what I've gathered, your aunt wanted to ensure that her assets would go to someone she trusted, someone who would appreciate the significance of what she was leaving behind. Michael and Emily exchanged stunned glances. The idea of inheriting a large sum of money and a property, especially one in Willow Creek, was both shocking and overwhelming. They had left that life behind, had fought so hard to move on, and now it was being thrust back into their lives in the most unexpected way. What does this mean? Emily asked, her voice shaky. What are we supposed to do with this information? Thomas offered a reassuring smile. There's no immediate decision required. I've brought the necessary paperwork for you to review, and I'm here to answer any questions you might have. However, it's important that you understand the implications of this inheritance. The property in Willow Creek is quite valuable, and the money could provide significant financial stability for your family. Michael felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. On one hand, the thought of financial stability was undeniably appealing, especially after everything they had been through. But on the other hand, the idea of returning to Willow Creek, of reopening old wounds, filled him with dread. Emily seemed to be struggling with the same feelings. She looked at Michael, her eyes filled with uncertainty. What do we do, Michael? This changes everything. Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. I don't know, Emily. We've worked so hard to build a life here, to move on from Willow Creek. But this is something we can't ignore. We need to think carefully about what's best for our family. Thomas, sensing their hesitation, spoke gently. I understand that this is a lot to process, and I don't expect you to make any decisions right away. Take your time, discuss it as a family, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll be in town for the next few days, and I'm available to meet at your convenience. Michael nodded, though his mind was still racing. Thank you, Mr. Avery. We'll take some time to think about it. Thomas handed them a folder containing the paperwork, along with his business card. Please, Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. I know this is a difficult decision, but I'm confident you'll make the right choice for your family." As Thomas walked back to his car, Michael and Emily stood in stunned silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. When the car finally disappeared down the driveway, Emily turned to Michael, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we going to do, Michael?" Michael looked down at the folder in his hands, feeling the enormity of the decision they now faced. "I don't know, Em, but whatever we decide, we'll do it together." That evening, after the children were asleep, Michael and Emily sat down at the kitchen table to review the documents Thomas had left. The details of the inheritance were staggering. Aunt Margaret's property was valued at a significant amount, and the money she had left behind could provide them with the financial stability they had been searching for. But with that opportunity came the realization that accepting the inheritance would mean confronting the past, revisiting the place that had caused them so much pain. It was a choice between the security they desperately needed and the emotional cost of returning to Willow Creek. "I never expected this," Emily said softly, her eyes scanning the pages in front of her. "I don't know why Aunt Margaret would leave this to me. We were never close." "Maybe she saw something in you, something she respected," Michael suggested. "Or maybe she just wanted to make sure her legacy went to someone who would appreciate it. Whatever the reason, this is a big decision, Emily." Emily nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "If we accept this, it could change everything. We could pay off our debts, secure the kids' future. But it would also mean going back to Willow Creek." Michael felt a lump form in his throat at the thought of returning to their old hometown. The memories of their struggles, their losses, and the pain they had endured were still fresh in his mind. "Do you think you could do it? Go back there?" Emily was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant as she considered the question. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Part of me wants to leave it all behind, to keep moving forward. But another part of me wonders if this is an opportunity we can't afford to pass up." Michael reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Whatever we decide, we'll face it together. We've been through so much already, and we've come out stronger. This is just another challenge, another choice we have to make." Emily squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. "I know, and I'm so grateful to have you by my side, Michael. I couldn't do this without you." They spent the next few days discussing their options, weighing the pros and cons of accepting the inheritance. The children were unaware of the situation, their days filled with the simple joys of summer, playing in the yard, riding their bikes through the neighborhood, and spending time with new friends. Michael and Emily wanted to keep it that way, at least until they had made a decision. Finally, after many sleepless nights and long conversations, they reached a conclusion. They would accept the inheritance, but with conditions. They would visit Willow Creek, assess the property, and determine if it was truly the right decision for their family. If they found that it was too painful, too difficult to return, they would consider selling the property and using the money to build a life elsewhere. When Michael called Thomas to inform him of their decision, the attorney was understanding and supportive. He arranged for them to visit the property in Willow Creek and assured them that he would handle all the legalities, making the process as smooth as possible. The day of their departure arrived, and as they loaded up the car, Michael and Emily couldn't help but feel a mix of anxiety and hope. They were returning to a place they had never expected to see again, but they were doing it on their own terms, with a newfound strength and resilience that had been forged through their struggles. As they drove toward Willow Creek, the familiar landscape began to unfold before them. The rolling hills, the dense woods, and the winding roads that led to the town they had once called home. The memories came flooding back, but this time, they were tempered by the knowledge that they had survived, that they had found a way to keep going, even when the odds were against them. When they finally arrived at Aunt Margaret's property, they were greeted by the sight of a large, stately house nestled among the trees. The house was old, but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and tall windows that offered a view of the surrounding landscape. It was beautiful in a way that spoke of history and tradition, and Michael could see why Aunt Margaret had been so attached to it. As they stepped out of the car and approached the house, Emily reached for Michael's hand, her grip tight with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. "This is it," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. "This is what she left us." Michael nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. "It's a lot to take in, but it's also an opportunity. Let's take a look inside, see what we're dealing with." They unlocked the door and stepped into the house, the air cool and still, as if waiting for them to bring it back to life. The interior was grand but dated, with antique furniture, heavy drapes, and ornate woodwork that spoke of a different time. There were photographs on the walls, faded portraits of ancestors long gone, and shelves filled with books and trinkets that told the story of a life well lived. As they explored the house, room by room, Michael and Emily began to see the possibilities. The property was in good condition, with only minor repairs needed, and the land surrounding it was vast and full of potential. It was a place that could offer them stability, a place where they could build a future for their children. But it was also a place filled with memories. Memories of the town they had left behind, of the life they had fought so hard to escape. And as they stood in the parlor, looking out at the sprawling grounds, Michael knew that the decision they had made was not one to be taken lightly. "We could make this work," Emily said quietly, her voice tinged with hope. "We could live here, raise the kids here. It's not what we planned, but maybe it's what we need." Michael looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. "It could be," he agreed, "but it's not just about us. It's about the kids, about what's best for our family. We need to make sure this is the right choice for all of us." Emily nodded, understanding the weight of the decision before them. "Let's take our time, think it through. We've been given this opportunity, but we don't have to rush into anything. We'll figure it out together." As they left the house and returned to the car, Michael felt a sense of clarity. They were standing at a crossroads, with a choice that would determine the course of their future. It was a daunting prospect, but it was also an opportunity to create something new, something better. The drive back to Cedarville was quiet, both of them lost in thought as they processed everything they had seen and felt. By the time they arrived home, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the town they had come to know as their sanctuary. That night, as they lay in bed, Michael and Emily talked late into the night, weighing their options, discussing their hopes and fears. They knew that the decision they made would shape the rest of their lives, and they wanted to be sure they were making the right one. By the time dawn broke, they had reached a decision that felt right, that felt like the culmination of everything they had been through. They would accept the inheritance, but they would not return to Willow Creek to live. Instead, they would sell the property, use the money to pay off their debts, and invest in their future in Cedarville. It was a compromise, a way to honor the legacy left to them while also staying true to the life they had begun to build. It was a decision that offered them both security and the freedom to continue moving forward. When Michael called Thomas to inform him of their choice, the attorney was supportive, agreeing to handle the sale of the property and the transfer of funds. It would take time, but the process would be smooth, and soon they would be able to put the past behind them once and for all. As the days passed, the Thompsons began to feel a sense of closure. The burden of their past was finally lifting, replaced by the hope and possibility of a brighter future. They had faced their demons, confronted their fears, and come out stronger on the other side. And as they stood together on their porch one evening, watching the sun set over Cedarville, Michael and Emily knew that they had made the right choice. They had found their way back to each other, back to the life they wanted to build, and they were ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. But as they would soon discover, life had one final twist in store for them, one that would test everything they had come to believe about love, family, and the meaning of home. The weeks following their decision to sell Aunt Margaret's property brought a sense of relief and renewed hope to the Thompson family. Cedarville had become their home, and with the financial burden lifted, they could finally focus on building the life they had always dreamed of. The sale of the property went smoothly, and as the money from the inheritance was transferred to their account, Michael and Emily felt as though a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. With the funds, they were able to pay off their debts, secure the future of their children, and even invest in their home, making it more comfortable and truly their own. The small house they had rented on the outskirts of town was transformed into a warm, welcoming space where laughter and love filled the air once more. As summer deepened, the Thompsons found themselves surrounded by a supportive community and a growing circle of friends. Michael had found a new job, working for a local contractor who had heard about his skills and work ethic. The job paid well and allowed him the stability he had been craving for so long. Emily, too, was thriving, not only at the diner but also through her volunteer work at the church, where she had become a beloved member of the congregation. Life, it seemed, had finally given them a reprieve. But just as they began to settle into this newfound peace, an unexpected event threatened to unravel everything they had worked so hard to achieve. It was a hot July afternoon when the letter arrived. Michael was at work, and Emily was in the garden with the children, enjoying the sun. The mail had been delivered earlier, but they hadn't yet had a chance to go through it. When Emily finally brought the stack of letters inside, she noticed one envelope that stood out. It was addressed to both her and Michael with no return address, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Curious, Emily opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As she read the contents, her face drained of color, and her hands began to tremble. The letter was brief, but its message was clear. It was from someone claiming to be a distant relative of Aunt Margaret, someone who believed they had a legal claim to the inheritance. The letter's tone was threatening, accusing Emily and Michael of taking what didn't belong to them. The writer demanded a meeting, insisting that they would take legal action if the Thompsons didn't agree to their terms. The letter ended with a promise that this matter would not be resolved until justice was served. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she reread the letter, trying to make sense of the situation. They had done everything by the book, with Thomas Avery handling the legal aspects of the inheritance. How could this be happening now, just when they thought they were finally free of the past? When Michael returned home that evening, Emily showed him the letter, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. Michael read the letter, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "This doesn't make any sense," Michael said, his brow furrowed. "We went through the proper legal channels. Thomas Avery made sure everything was in order. How could someone come out of nowhere and claim they have a right to the inheritance?" "I don't know," Emily replied, her eyes wide with fear. "But they sound serious, Michael. What if they really do have a claim? What if we lose everything?" Michael pulled her into his arms, trying to calm her. "We're not going to lose everything, Emily. We'll call Thomas first thing tomorrow and find out what's going on. He'll know how to handle this." But despite his reassuring words, Michael couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut. The timing of the letter, coming just as they were beginning to rebuild their lives, felt like a cruel twist of fate. The next morning, Michael contacted Thomas Avery and explained the situation. Thomas was as shocked as they were, assuring them that he had thoroughly investigated the estate and that no other relatives had come forward during the legal proceedings. "I'll look into this immediately," Thomas said, his voice calm and professional. "It's possible this is a scam or someone trying to intimidate you. But rest assured, if there's any legitimacy to their claim, we'll handle it through the proper legal channels." Days passed as they waited for Thomas to investigate, each one filled with a growing sense of dread. Emily could hardly sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of what could happen if the claim were true. Michael did his best to stay strong, but he too felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, threatening to undo all the progress they had made. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas called with an update. The news was a mixture of relief and concern. He had found no evidence to support the claim, but the person behind the letter had a history of legal disputes over inheritance matters. They were known for making baseless claims in the hopes of extorting money from unsuspecting families. "It appears this person is trying to scare you into giving up a portion of the inheritance," Thomas explained. "It's a tactic they've used before, and in most cases the claims are dismissed. However, if they do pursue legal action, we'll need to be prepared to fight it in court." Michael and Emily listened carefully, their fear turning to anger as they realized they were being targeted by someone trying to take advantage of their situation. "What should we do?" Michael asked, his voice firm with resolve. "We don't want to be bullied, but we also don't want to get caught up in a long, drawn-out legal battle. I recommend we send a strong response through my office, Thomas replied. We'll make it clear that you are represented by legal counsel and that we will not tolerate any further harassment. In most cases, that's enough to make these people back off. If they continue to push, we'll take it to court, but I'm confident we can win if it comes to that. Michael agreed to Thomas's plan, and over the next few days, Thomas prepared and sent the response. The letter was direct and firm, warning the claimant that any further attempts to extort money from the Thompsons would result in legal action. The days that followed were tense, but the claimants made no further contact. It seemed that the threat of legal action had been enough to make them back down. As the weeks passed without any more letters or calls, Michael and Emily began to breathe easier, though the experience had left them shaken. Despite the resolution, the ordeal had brought old fears to the surface, fears of losing everything they had worked so hard to build. It was a reminder that life, no matter how carefully planned, could be unpredictable and that the past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. But as summer turned to fall, the Thompsons found themselves returning to a sense of normalcy. The community in Cedarville continued to support them, offering friendship, kindness, and a sense of belonging that had been missing from their lives for so long. One crisp autumn evening, as the family sat together around a bonfire in their backyard, Michael and Emily took a moment to reflect on everything they had been through. "We've come so far, Michael," Emily said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "It hasn't been easy, and I know we'll still face challenges, but I'm so grateful for where we are now." Michael nodded, feeling the warmth of the fire and the closeness of his family. "I am too, Emily. We've been tested in ways I never imagined, but we've come out stronger. We've learned what it means to truly rely on each other, to face whatever life throws at us together." As they watched the flames dance in the night, surrounded by the love and laughter of their children, Michael and Emily knew that they had passed the final test. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with moments of doubt, fear, and pain, but it had also been a journey of growth, love, and resilience. They had found their way back to each other, had built a life filled with hope and possibility, and had learned that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they could face them together. And as the fire crackled and the stars began to shine overhead, Michael and Emily held each other close, knowing that they had finally found their true home. Not in a place, but in the strength of their love and the bonds they had forged as a family. The future was still uncertain, but it was also filled with promise. They had survived the storms, had weathered the darkest nights, and now they were ready to embrace whatever came next, with faith, love, and the unshakable belief that together they could overcome anything.